In this video, we're going to add a few more tweaks to the streetscape that we modeled previously, as well as adding the road markings and then looking at how we can start modeling the entrance steps to our building just before we start the actual facade. So first of all, I want to just have a look at this edge here, which is quite glaring. We want to move these three edges down so that they meet the road, since this is the car entrance up into the parking. So we can move these three segments down by minus 0.15 meters, so it's half a foot. And we can also go and add some more detail to the pavement edge. Now in the previous lesson we sweeped it with a rectangular or at least a square bar shape, and what we can do now, just to give it a slightly more realistic edge, we can add an editable poly, and we can select this upper edge and we can loop that all the way across so that it traces the entire length. Then we can go and chamfer that, and you can either create a small chamfer, quite a large one, or add segments to it if you want a rounded edge. So I'm just going to leave a chamfer with three edges, three segments. So what we have there is just a slight rounding to the pavement edge that will create a slight smoother effect, and you can go and do the same thing on all of these edges here by just selecting one edge, looping, and then chamfering that, and doing the same thing here. If you find that this is too wide or too big, you can go and add an editable poly. You can go move that around. For example, if you want this line to align, you can just make those tweaks at this level to make things look the way you want to. For example, here I see that there is a slight hole, so we can select that vertex and we can chamfer it. And we can just chamfer it like so that we cover that little gap that there was. So here I'm just talking about these smaller types of edits. You'll see here as well that there is a gap underneath the planter, so what we need to do is we need to keep this editable poly and go and take if we just look from underneath, we can take that poly underneath and we can go and move it down. Since I can't see the gizmo in my screen, I'm just going to use this, and I can just move it out off screen so that it's visibly below the surface. Now, over to the entrance, you'll have a look that if you turn on the layers for the building, you'll see that the walls stop here. There's a kind of porte-cochere, well, not really a porte-cochere for cars, but at least a rain cover, so people can step up, and there's a kind of entrance to the building here. So what we want to do is we want to, instead of building things up from the zero plane, we want to keep our building, the ground floor, at zero, and everything below that will be below the zero in our model space, if you understand what I'm saying. Hopefully that's not too complicated, but you'll see what I'm doing once we get started with this. So now that we're not busy with context or roads, we are busy with the entrance steps, and we can go and create a new layer for that, and we can call that 02, and we can call that slabs, since it will be the beginning of the slab for the ground floor. So I'm going to start drawing that slab by doing a line, and selecting my snap, I just trace what the CAD information is giving me. And I'm going to select or at least trace the uppermost layer. I'm going to close that spline, and this will now be at zero. And all these steps will move down from it. So what I can do is when I extrude it, I can extrude it downwards instead of up. So we can choose minus, let's say minus 0.45. And minus 0.45 is deliberate in meters because that is the height of these three steps. So what you can go and do then is you can either use rectangles or boxes, and you can extrude that similarly. So EXT, enter, and extrude that by 0.15, and then you can go and move that step downwards. I just used my snap again to move it down, and I'm going to make a copy, and then this copied version, I just hold down spacebar to do a selection lock. And I'm just going to move that down. You'll see that it's actually below the road level right now. So what we need to do is we need to move down the road object that we created earlier. So we're going to move that down by the 450. So we can go and select the road, the pavement edges that we created earlier, making sure not to select any of the CAD geometry. So if you're afraid to accidentally select and move CAD geometry, what you can do is you can go to your CAD layers here, select them. You can either select the ones you're working on or all of them, and then go ahead and select them in your scene by clicking here. And then in object properties, just go in general and freeze them. And then you can uncheck the show frozen in gray. That way you can't really select them accidentally. If your snaps aren't working, just remember to go across to your options and then make sure your snap to frozen object is selected. Otherwise you won't be able to snap to your CAD layers. That's quite important. So now that we have that, we can select these layers that we created earlier, the pavement edges, roads, etc., and all of that, and we can move it down by -0.45. And then we'll see what that is starting to look like. So now we have our lowest level of road, we step up to the pavement, and then we go up our 3 steps into the entrance. Now, just before I finish this lesson, I'd like to add a little bit more detail to the roads. You'll see that we have a layer called Plan Road. Now, these are the road markings, and I would like to actually show these in my model. Now, I could go and map, or at least paint a texture with all of these road markings on them, but since I already have the CAD geometry, and the CAD geometry has been well drawn, I can go ahead and extract out these shapes and actually use that instead of a texture. So to get started with that, you can select it and then go Control V again, make a copy like we did the last time, and you can isolate that selection, and let's just make some space for ourselves, and this can now be called, you can actually put it on the road layer, there's no problem in doing that. Now immediately we can add a editable poly modifier. You could also shell it or even extrude it, as long as you add a modifier that adds a solidity to these splines. So I'm going to use editable poly just because it won't add any more extra geometry. And you'll see that some things have disappeared, and that's because we need to do some vertex welding. You'll have a look that if we now add a material to it, let's just add a plain white material and hit F3, you'll see that it is all being shaded in. So that's what we want. But we want to make sure that some of these other objects are actually all joined. So let's just go to the vertices and select that whole lot. Do the same thing here. And we can just right click and weld those vertices. Once that's welded, you'll see that the object appears solid. And you'll see here that we've actually messed up the P there, so we can go back and then just make sure that that P is welded and that that shape is extracted. I'm not going to get into too much detail right now since it's not really the point. You could go and retype this in Max. It might be the better way of doing it if you want cleaner geometry, because you'll see here that we have thousands of little vertices, and that's not really what we want. So just to show you quickly, the text tool is you just in your splines go down to text, hit that, change your text, call that stop, and then you can adjust, make it bolder, change it to maybe Arial black, and once you have that, you can do the same thing to your text layer by just adding a editable poly and moving that into place. E for turn that into place, scale it up to look more or less the same scale. Either scale it up in your viewport or just go directly using the size here. So let's say that's 2 meters big, move it into place. So that is it for the road markings. Just one last thing that I'd like to point out to you just before we close this lesson is that once you have the road markings in place, you want to position them just slightly above the object that they're going to be sitting on, so above the road. They can be a centimeter or two. And what I recommend is that you right click and that you just undo the cast shadow properties. This will stop any shadows from casting below this, since it's supposed to be a painted surface, so you don't want to see a shadow below the painted surface. That wouldn't be real. And once you have that done, you can actually hide the other layers that you don't want to see. And you'll see that you have your CAD geometry that is now your road marking. You can do the same thing to the stop, move it down, make a white texture for it, and then just undo the shadows. So there you have it. Now you have your streetscape, you have your road markings in place, your pavement edges and all that, and we will get straight into modeling the actual facade in the next lesson.